these three. One is guided noticing. Then we're going to look at some scaffolded instruction. And then we will look at contextualized practice. And with each of these three, we'll talk about what they are and then how we can implement them in our classrooms. So first, guided noticing. And you might be thinking, well, noticing, I've heard about noticing, but what do you mean by guided noticing? And that's exactly what we're going to look at. So before we can learn something, we have to notice it. And probably all of us have experienced something where you hear a word and you think, wow, I've never heard that word before. Or you see something and you think, I've never seen that before. And then all of a sudden, you keep running into that word or that sight. And so that's noticing. That's the first thing. For me, it was the word several years ago, mockumentary. I had never heard that word, or I thought I'd never heard it. And then I started hearing it everywhere. So I had noticed it, and then I became aware of it, and then it became part of my productive vocabulary. The other thing about noticing is just bolding words doesn't necessarily cause noticing. So we're going to look at some examples here. We're going to look at 4 different ways to guide noticing. We're going to help students engage with texts to identify a pattern. We'll look at analyzing a writing task. And we'll also see how form influences meaning and use, which to us as teachers is no surprise. And we'll see how writers use different resources and how that works to create effective essays. So here we go, on to the land of guided noticing. So here's a text, and some words are in bold. And maybe our learners would notice those words, maybe they wouldn't. But if they did notice them, what are they supposed to do with them? I think that's what happens with just bolding. And so this is bolded, and the students are looking at this and they're thinking, well, maybe words that begin with D and S get bolded. I don't know, maybe that's what I'm supposed to notice. But by using a guided noticing technique, we can have the students interact with the text, go back and find the sentences and put in the words, and these will be the words that were bolded. And then we can actually have the students, rather than just rotely finding the word and writing it here, we ask them a question to look at the words that they've now filled in, which of they're all verbs, and which of them end in S, and then we can talk about subject-verb agreement. We can bring up ideas so that students will actively be engaged in noticing. And this will help their learning and raise their awareness of subject-verb agreement in this case. We can also do noticing activities with a writing task. Perhaps we've taught our students how to organize texts using point-by-point or block method or whatever other method you want to use. And so in this case, we actually have students going back to the text again. And the idea here is that the students are not just reading a text and being done with it, but they're actually going back and forth. And then in addition to talking about different types of writing tasks and how they might be structured, we can also notice the specific grammar that's being used. And so again, we're still focusing on a compare and contrast task. And we're seeing how certain words, like in contrast or while, can be used in different ways, and how some of them can automatically, in a sense, well, no, not in a sense, how they can automatically be followed by certain punctuation, or how words that express contrast sometimes have subtle different meanings. And so by having students look at these individual markers of contrast and talk about how they're different or how they're similar and how they can be used to express contrast and great contrast, or how they automatically signal certain types of punctuation, this can all be very helpful for our learners. And it's a way of raising awareness and noticing. And then finally, as we look at the writing process and we think about how introductions and conclusions are linked, we can see that, again, having this list and raising awareness. So basically, all of this guided noticing that we've looked at in these examples, all of these, the main purpose is to have students interact with the text in a meaningful way, to not have them just read something and try to go on, but actually think about the text. What went into creating this text? What resources did we use? And how can we be more aware of those resources? So that's the goal of guided noticing and helping our students also interact with texts and talk about texts. I'm a big believer in the need to talk about texts and talk about why certain grammar features or certain patterns are found in texts, and rather than just trying to mindlessly memorize language. So now we're going to go on to one of my favorite topics, which is scaffolded instruction. So when we think about scaffolding, we might be thinking about a building. And if you think about a building, if you've gone by a building that's being built, it often has this scaffolding that's an external structure that helps it support the construction of the building. But once the building is built, the scaffolding is gone, right? We don't walk around seeing scaffolding that just stays there after the building is completed. And the same is true with our instruction. So many times when we are providing structured practice, we forget to remove some of that scaffolding. So it's really important to think about our role as a teacher of providing that external support for our students, but then carefully taking it away as they gain a greater foundation, just like a building. And so structured and scaffolded instruction involves structured practice. And the notion of structured practice is that it moves from being very, very controlled to removing some of that control and going towards open-ended tasks, because that's how we use language. We use language to communicate. We always have a function or a purpose. And it also can include the use of models. And I think that it's important. Sometimes when people think about models, they think, oh, then the students are going to write just like that model. But again, this comes back to using a model to talk about text. So as we provide models, we might provide different models and talk about how they're different to accomplish different goals. But in all of this, in all of our instruction, and I think scaffolded instruction provides a huge role here, the goal is learner autonomy. As teachers, none of us want to be always the one that the students have to come to. We want the students to be able to learn how to learn, which is why we're doing part of the focus of this webinar. And we want them to then become autonomous learners. So we're going to look at an example of moving through scaffolded instruction. And we're going to do this looking at the idea of expressing necessity, which is something that's a little tricky. So those of us who have taught for a number of years, or even those of you who are beginning teachers, you know how tricky modals can be for our students, and you know how expressing permission or possibility or necessity is one of the things that's really pragmatically challenging. So we're going to look at this example of expressing necessity through a whole scaffolded process. So in the first part here, the students are just listening. So they've got a gap fill activity in front of them, and they're just having to listen and write the form. Of course, these forms have been introduced, so I'm not showing you the introduction of these forms. They've gone through the lesson, they've looked at grammar charts, they've looked at these forms. And so now we're looking at the first part of the students of the scaffolding for using these. And in this case, it's very tightly controlled. There's a gap that's being filled, but the students are just listening to be able to fill that gap. And the other thing that I want to point out here is that this is an activity that involves multiple skills. Students are reading, they're listening, and they're writing. And so this actually also provides a bit of scaffolding for what happens in academic coursework or in classes that students will be taking, where they'll be listening to a lecture or listening to classmates and taking notes. So this also models, but in a very controlled way, the tasks that students will be doing. So in this case, we've got different forms. The other thing that I want to point out with this listening activity is that if you don't have the audio, you can't complete the task. So this task is authentic. It's not a gap fill activity that's supposed to be an audio activity, a listening activity that students can complete without the audio. So it's really, really important that we have authentic tasks, that we ask our learners to engage in something that requires them to listen, rather than just having an activity where they can complete it without listening. So moving a little bit further away from this highly controlled activity, we move on to a different type of activity here, where we have an example of an email exchange between Blanca, Jason, and Claire, and also Nick. And in this case, the students are writing. They're given the form that they're going to complete. So they're having more choice here. They're having to match the subject and the verb together and get the form inflected correctly. So we've upped the ante a bit. We've removed some of the scaffolding. It's not as carefully controlled, but it's still quite controlled. Next, as we move further along away from the scaffolding and toward greater independence, we can ask the student to do things that are personal to them. So asking, what's one thing you have to do every day? And then they would fill that out using some of the forms to express necessity. And so we do this. It's a topic that a student knows about. They know, what is something you do at work or school that you don't have to do. So we're looking at negatives. What's something that you must do at work or school? So in this case, the student is the expert, and they are personalizing this to themselves, but it's open-ended. And so more of the scaffolding is removed. And now we go one step further, where students work in pairs, and they ask each other these questions. And many of us stop here. Many of us say, okay, we've given our students some really good practice, and they can do this with each other, they can do this by themselves, they can do this with each other, and that's really great. And my students are autonomous learners. But our classrooms are very, very safe environments, at least they should be. And we're very tolerant of accommodating learners. We're very tolerant of the errors that our learners make, and very supportive and nurturing. And that's really important and good. But when our students go out into the real world, it's not always that way. So we want to be able to let our students have that experience also. So I think the next step that's often missing in our classes is that taking it to the outside world. And so, or outside the classroom, not really the outside world. It is sort of the outside world from our classroom. So in this case, I think we could take those same questions and have our learners go outside and use those questions in different contexts. Or we could actually, as a class, maybe come up with some other questions that we're interested in. And we could have students ask about maybe their study habits. Do you study every day? Is it important for you to study every day? Do your homework? Do you do your homework and for your classes and turn it in every day? They could be asking these types of questions. So you can have your students have an assignment where they have to ask either roommates or friends, Or even if it's a more advanced group, maybe just going to some public or common area and randomly asking people questions. And that's a really, really scary thing, especially if you're doing it in a language that isn't your first language and that you possibly don't completely control. But that's what we have to do. We have to be able to have those experiences and see what we truly control. Because so often in our language learning classrooms, we can get a false sense of our ability to communicate. And also we can become very comfortable just communicating with our classmates and our teachers and other students in the program. But that isn't why we're learning a language. We're actually wanting to communicate with other people and experience ideas and concepts and talk to people who we don't know very well. And so in this case, we have students ask and get the responses. Maybe they take some notes or they record them with their phones. Seems like everybody has a phone that can do all sorts of fancy recording now. And then bring those responses back to the class and talk about it. And not only talk about the responses, but talk about how it went. What was hard? What was scary? How can we do this? How can we, help our learners? And of course, if it's a beginning class, if it's a lower level class, you wouldn't be doing, first of all, you wouldn't be doing something as sophisticated perhaps as communicating necessity in that complex way. But you could be doing something at a easier level and maybe bringing some people from other classes into your classroom to talk to your learners at a lower level. But I think this idea of having students engage outside the classroom is really, really important. And it's an important part of our scaffolded process so that we begin with something very tightly controlled, and then we move gradually to more open-ended and more autonomous and different contexts of use. And it's exactly the notion of context that we're going to look at next. And here we're going to give credit to Steve Krashen. A lot of people are unhappy with ideas from Krashen, but he also has some good ideas. So I think it's important to acknowledge what is good. And so here the point is, and I think this quote is really, really important. Language is best taught when it's being used to transmit messages, not when it is explicitly taught for conscious learning. And I think this is a nice bridge, if you will, from the scaffolding to contextualized practice. Because so many times in grammar classes, particularly, we have the situation where students are practicing these forms and they're practicing them in sort of a decontextualized manner and often in something that's not very scaffolded. So I think as teachers, as we think about how we help our learners learn, we want to be constantly challenging ourselves to think, what's the best way for us to scaffold this activity so that learners have greater autonomy? And then also, how can we contextualize that practice? And I think that in grammar classes particularly, it's really difficult for us to sometimes contextualize that practice because we have to provide practice, and part of it is going to be rote. It's going to be repetition and exposure to a form over and over, but it's also got to be meaningful. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at some ways to encourage contextualized practice. So one of the first things as we look at different structures that we're introducing, we want to be able to think about what are the tasks that our students are going to face with these structures. And that's kind of tricky with some structures, but I think with almost everything, verbs, we can think easily how this can translate into different types of learning activities. And we have to have vocabulary. I mean, vocabulary is so important. And I think many times we think of grammar as being separate from vocabulary, but vocabulary and grammar have such an intimate relationship, and so we have to build vocabulary and grammar together as we work in our classes. So we're going to look at how grammar features work together to accomplish communicative goals. Again, this is emphasizing contextualized practice as the focus is on communicative goals. And then we're going to look at some charts, graphs, and writing tasks. And I think that as we look at charts and graphs, many of us have been educated in an English language environment or as an English major. And in those cases, we often don't have a lot of exposure to charts and graphs. And I think that and also sometimes to different writing tasks. And that's what we're going to look at, because most of our students are not going to be English majors. They're going to be science majors, business majors, engineering majors, and we need to prepare them to meet the demands of those disciplines. So here's an example of just a reading with a chart. And in this case, the chart and the reading are obviously they're related, but it's not really giving a lot of interpretation to that chart. But this is something that we can talk to our students about. We can give them the language to talk about charts and graphs. And so in this case, we're starting the scaffolding process in this contextualized example of reading and looking at a chart and talking about it, but not doing much else. And then it's also important, there are many, many different types of graphs and charts. And our students who are in these majors of science and engineering and business, they will be expected to be able to look at charts, look at different types of charts, and interpret those charts. So one of the activities that we can do is we can have a listening activity where students are having to listen to information and create a chart and then talk about it with a partner. And this of course has been scaffolded, where before this activity you would have been talking about, you would have introduced different types of charts, different types of graphs, different types of tables, and how to take maybe information from a table and turn it into a chart. Now this might be, you might be thinking, oh, but I'm an English teacher. But we use language to describe these charts. We have to be able to hear and understand the language and then produce this chart in this activity. We can also, so the previous example, in this example, this is a pretty high level example where learners are doing a very complex task. They're listening, they're interpreting that information, they're placing it into a visual representation, and then they're talking with a partner. So this is a very high level. But even at a lower level, we can give students a graph like this, a bar chart in this case, and we can have them talk about it, and then we can also have them write sentences and present that information. So take this information that's displayed visually and turn it into written language. So this is something that could be done at a low intermediate level. It could be talked about probably at a high beginner level. I think it's also important as we think about preparing our students for the tasks that they will encounter in their future to think about typical writing tasks. And I think, if we take an inventory of what types of tasks students have to do in writing, we come up with a list similar to this, but this doesn't represent the entire world of writing, but it does represent 6 of the very common writing tasks that students have to do. And I think in our classes, we're really good at the argumentative and persuasive tasks and practicing those. And we're also really good at narrative tasks. But sometimes we don't emphasize synthesis enough. And that's a really tricky task, but one that is done in almost any discipline that our students are going to be going into, and something that's really important as students learn to, at a higher level, read and synthesize information. So this is really important. And I think it's also, as we think about our students, if they're going into, say, business, they're going to be doing types of tasks like case studies. Those are have specific requirements that we need to be able to, as students become more advanced, include in our writing instruction. We need to be able to talk about how to structure those different types of texts and look at them and provide ways of discussing the different demands and the different structures. So we're going to look at that for a second. So we want to see how grammar resources work together, because many times in our grammar classes, we're presenting one structure, like maybe we're looking at past tense, simple past tense, but none of us go through the day simply talking in past tense or present progressive. We actually use lots of different grammar resources together. And so if we were to think about writing a problem solution paper or essay, we would think, what features go together in that? And in that, we get a lot of noun phrases because we're talking about a problem or presenting a solution. And because we're presenting a solution, we have a lot of purpose clauses, how to do things. When we think about cause and effect writing tasks, we see that present tense is really common. We get modals. We get if and unless. So if this happens, then this effect is blah, 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 unless we do something else. And we also have some patterns of cause and effect with nouns that are really common. These are also really linked with certain adjectives, but we're not going to go into those. But the idea is that there are these features that are sometimes very common in the writing tasks that we're asking our students to do, and we want to make sure that our students know how to make these tasks work together. So some ideas and ways to provide contextualized practice to accomplish these different tasks. One would be to have students write an argumentative or a persuasive essay and have them have a specific audience in mind. So maybe they're trying to write their supervisor or their boss or their teacher for an extension or a day off from the boss, maybe an extension for a paper from the teacher, if the teacher is the audience, although we don't really want to encourage that, obviously. But we would have students write this paper with that audience in mind, and then have them later on write that same persuasive goal, but with a different audience. So maybe instead of a teacher or a boss, it might be a friend, or it could be maybe a parent or someone who they are closer to, and then talk about what changed in the paper. How did changing the audience change the language that was used in that paper, and actually talk about that. We can also take something like a personal narrative, which we often have our students write a lot of personal narratives, but then take that personal narrative and write it as an informational text, and then talk about how it changed, how the use of pronouns changed, how the sentence structures changed. So these are all pretty easy ideas to implement, but ones that really help our students become aware of how grammar and vocabulary, how it works together to communicate ideas. So, in wrapping up, we have explored different ways. We've looked at guided noticing and ways that we can enhance how our students interact with texts. We've looked at scaffolded instruction and seen the importance of carefully moving from tightly controlled, like we're so good at in grammar classes, to more open-ended and contextualized practice. And I hope that you can see that a theme throughout this has been the idea of students interacting with texts, talking about texts, and looking at the communicative purposes and the functions of these texts and how our resources can work together to accomplish those. And we have some useful resources here at Cambridge. These are two nice series that I've been involved in, Grammar and Beyond. Some of you may be familiar with that. And then also we have a new series that has just come out called Grammar and Beyond Essentials. And so you might look at some of these if you want some of these. My examples came from these texts. And I'm happy, I think we have some time to answer any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And also later on today, I'm doing a webinar that's focusing on lots of activities if you're interested in just seeing more activities. So let me see if I can see some questions here. Okay, so there's a question about discourse analysis and choosing the materials, and I think that's very true. I think that, you know, in a sense, what we've been talking about is a form of discourse analysis. We're looking at what's the communicative goal? Is it persuasion? Is it an information essay? Or is it an oral presentation? So this idea of discourse analysis is certainly a thread that I'm very, very committed to. Let's see, are there other questions? Oh, let's see. Oh, so how can we put students at ease when they have to speak to strangers, as I used in one of my examples? I think that that's a really hard question. I think some of our learners are just super happy going out there and their high interactive style and make mistakes with perfect confidence. And then there's some who are very timid and shy. That's just, we have different personalities, but we're all going to have to talk to people. And so I think one way, if you know that a lot of your learners are very timid, or, and I don't mean timid in a negative sense, but I mean cautious. I think one way to do that is to really practice in the classroom and then model it, have role plays, maybe bring some people who the students know but don't know well into the classroom, maybe teachers from other classes or other levels, and then just have them go try it. And, you know, just say, you have to ask one question, just try one question. And then a couple weeks later, you've got to try 2 questions. But this is just a really, I think it's really important for us to do that for our learners. So taking that next step is important. Another question was, is there a good way to encourage students to write? Well, writing is painful for all of us, even those of us who are very fluent users of the language. Writing something that's informational is hard. And so I think acknowledging that is important, and just doing writing fluency activities, having students write journal activities, doing speed writing activities in the class. We'll be looking at some of these activities in the next webinar that I'll be doing later today. So.
Thank you, Randy. Now, I'll give some time for a little bit, a few more questions if any more come through, but I just wanted to remind everyone that there was a certificate of attendance available for download here on the screen now, and also that I saw a lot of questions during the presentation about will this be recorded. It is absolutely being recorded, and we are going to post the recording. It usually takes about 2 weeks, and then what we'll do is anybody that registered or attended the webinar, we will email you a link to the recording.
Well, I think we're probably ready to wrap up, I would guess. And I really appreciate all of you taking time. I know you're all very busy, and we represent a lot of different time zones here. So some of us it's morning, and some of us it's probably nighttime or the middle of the night. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope it was worth your time.
And thanks again, Randy. Thanks for your time and all your advice.
Okay. Well, I hope to see some of you later.